everyone, my name is John Carradini. I am one of the dual enrolled MD MPH students, and I'm actually based out of Tulsa. And today I'll be presenting on the state's involvement in the insurance exchanges or marketplaces, depending on which vernacular you use. The health insurance marketplaces were actually a hallmark feature of the Affordable Care Act of 2010, and it was on these marketplaces that individuals, families, and small business employers, less than 100 employees, would be able to find the various health plans. Now, there are the health plans from bronze up to platinum, and also the catastrophe plans that cover different things. And it's on these marketplaces that individuals, the employers, and the families would be able to find out which coverage is right for them. And it's also on these marketplaces that if someone was to be eligible for one of the subsidies between 100% of the federal poverty line and 400% of the federal poverty line for income, would be able to use those subsidies in such a way. Now, Section 1321 of the Affordable Care Act gives a lot of flexibility and latitude to the states in how they can create and operate their own exchange. There are currently state-based marketplaces, which is where the state does all of the recruitment, does all of the call center work, and then also decides which plans go into their market. Then there are the state-based marketplaces on the federal platform where they do the first parts, they do the recruitment and the call center, but then they use the federal platform on healthcare.gov to actually enroll people. And then there's the state-based marketplace that with a partnership whereby the Department of Health and Human Services does almost everything, but the state does their own recruitment. And then there is the federally facilitated marketplace, which is what Oklahoma does, whereby all of the action is done by the federal government. There are currently 12 states that have an SBM, like California, New York, and Idaho. And there are 5 states that do the SBM FP, which is like Arkansas. There are, I believe, 6 that do the partnership, and then the rest, 28, do the federal facility marketplace, like I said, Oklahoma. And then Section 2201 looked at Medicaid for how it involves with the state marketplaces. So the reason why this was important was because we saw that there were a lot of inequities with access to care. The biggest issues being the high-risk pool, whereby people with pre-existing conditions weren't able to get coverage because insurers did not want to incur that extra risk for what they could not see as an overall benefit. And it was actually seen that about 60% of people over the age of 65 could be classified as not eligible for insurance, though they are eligible for Medicare. It was also important because cost was a huge factor. About 60% of people who declared bankruptcy pre-ACA were actually due to medical concerns, though we do see some bankruptcy still today that has, and by some reports, decreased by about half. There are also issues with access for the working poor. So if people did not meet the Medicaid threshold of their state, they would not be able to have insurance in any way, shape, or form because they wouldn't be able to afford it. Now, the Affordable Care Act did lay out for an expansion of Medicaid to 138%, of the federal poverty line, but when the Supreme Court decided that was unconstitutional, it actually messed up the marketplaces just a little bit. We'll talk about that here in a little bit as well. So it was clear that there was a need for something different, and different groups, actually an article from the Annals of Internal Medicine laid out some different reforms, and they actually named by name a state-based health insurance marketplace as a way to spread out the risk associated with those high-risk pools. So the idea is that you can have more people that are paying into a system they're not necessarily using to be able to defer the cost of those high-risk individuals. And then they also called for more access for their poorer populations. And then another article I saw talked about cost in that the state of Washington did about $171 million in uncompensated care in their hospitals in 2007, and it was ideally going to be able to mitigate some of those costs with the expansion and the usage of health insurance exchanges. So I'm looking specifically at the state-based medical exchanges and marketplaces. And what they found was that there was a huge population benefit, and so a lot of people have been able to have access through the state-based marketplaces. About 3.5 million people use the SBMs today, but there is 7.5 million that uses the FFM model. But remember, there's about a half to a third that are using, or a half to a fifth that use the SBM. So there's actually more enrollees per state in the SBMs. And SBM has saw an increase of 2% of enrollment from 2017 to 2018, whereas the federally facilitated marketplaces have lost 10% of their enrollees. So we can see that there's increase in the SBM versus FFM. Also, the cost is less for the SBM. So their premiums, I believe in 2018, was an average of $378, whereas the premiums for the FFM were upwards of about $420. So we can see that it's about $50 cheaper per person for premiums to use the SBMs. And not only that, but in looking at insurance claims, the claims were less under the SBM model than in the FFM model. This leads to questions about, is there enough access? Are people getting the care that they need? Because other people have shown that there are more what are called narrow networks. So that's where people have less choice because of the location of the physician or the busyness of the physician. About 42% of the plans in the SBM models are defined as narrow, whereas only 10% are in the FFM. So while the cost is lower in the SBM model, it's seen that there is less access to those actual providers. However, another report showed that the states that have SBMs, namely California, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, these areas have higher and better health outcomes than those in the federally facilitated marketplaces. Unfortunately, there haven't been a lot of research into if there's a one-to-one cost. So if the actual individuals are healthier in the SBMs versus FFM models, but it's also known that the SBM states are some of the more affluent states. I can't rattle off all 12 of them right now, but if you want, feel free to look at them and you'll see that the per capita income is actually higher in those 12 states than in the other ones that are FFM. Administration-wise, this program is overseen by the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, and this was to whom the different states could apply for grants starting at the beginning of the project. So this law went into effect, this law for the health insurance exchanges and the necessary to have them or have a decision on them was January 1 of 2014. And so it was by that time that governors and the state had to tell the secretary what their intentions were. So for instance, Oklahoma decided that they did not want to do an exchange, and so Governor Fallin sent a letter to the secretary letting the secretary know of our stance on that. But California in 2011 created the first marketplace, and they declared that they were going to do that. And there were grants for states that wanted to pursue the creation of their own marketplace. And so California took advantage of that, and the state of Oklahoma did not, because the federal government knew that these marketplaces would be extremely cost prohibitive to create, but then once they're up and running, could actually save money. Now that grant application window has closed, and so people can't apply to those anymore. So the administration of the law is mostly from the state level in those state-based marketplaces. So California, New York, Idaho, they manage all of their own resources. The Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services oversees the federally facilitated marketplaces for the other 28 states and also the federal platform and the partnerships. For the stakeholders, the insurance companies are people who actually end up not benefiting from this change because they have lower claims and they also have lower claims, but they also report lower profits. This is a concern for the people who are financing healthcare, but we know that this is increasing the ability for people to pay for it. There are also the rural communities, which appear to have a higher enrollment under the SBM models as opposed to the FFM models. And also, people in general have better enrollment and have better access to insurance plans that fit their needs in the SBM models. And providers also benefit from this because they have more people that they're able to see, and they're not going to have as much risk to not be repaid. So in the evaluation, it appears that the SBMs are operating better than the FFMs. There's also reports that there's less insurance carrier leaving during the enrollment periods for the SBMs, meaning that there's more opportunity for people to enroll in them. So there's less what's called insurance churn. So insurance churn is when you have different plans from year to year, which results in poorer outcomes and more stress. The cost is down, there's less administrative burden, there's higher access, there's higher rural access. The only problem, so going back to access, the only problem is that in that same SBM model, people don't have as much choice in the providers that they see. So they have more choice in the initial insurance program, but they have less choice in who they actually see day to day. But like I've said, the states that have SBMs have some of the highest healthcare, some of the best healthcare outcomes, and some of the highest and best functioning healthcare systems. So, in conclusion, I would recommend that SBMs expand and that the grant window be opened up again for people to apply for these SBMs, and that you maybe even make it a law whereby people need to have the SBMs because it's clear that the cost is contained, there is better outcome, and more people are able to get it or to get coverage under justice and fairness. Thank you, and have a great day.